Singapore was already in a terrible position prior to independence. 2/3 of its million population lived in slums, with many addicted to opium. Its highly mixed population was increasingly breaking out into violence. It had no significant industry, and unemployment was already high. Its newfound independence now meant it was without access to natural resources, as the island has none. Its larger and more powerful neighbors were not only going to cut it off from trade, but were actively hostile to Singapore's existence. To make matters even worse, British military forces were withdrawing from the island, taking with them 20% of the remaining economy. Singapore appeared to be destined for underdevelopment, violence, and poverty. Yet today, Singapore is the 4th richest nation on Earth. Its citizens are among the most educated, healthy, and productive of any country. It has the best infrastructure in the world, it is a leader in high-tech manufacturing, and is the financial and logistical hub of all of Southeast Asia. But how did this unlikely, poor, and tiny Asian island nation go on to become one of the best places to live in the world? How did Singapore become so incredibly rich? In the 19th century, there was a corporation so powerful it brought in more revenue than its host nation, had its own military, and a fifth of the entire world's population lived on its private lands. That corporation was the British East India Company. It derived its profits from shipping and trading resources from all over the world, and its most lucrative cargo was Chinese tea. To purchase the tea, it would sell massive quantities of opium that it grew in northern India. All of this shipping happened to pass through one narrow corridor known as the Malacca Strait. Quickly, this became the company's most profitable trade route, constituting 50% of its revenue. But in order to protect this route and to make the voyage more feasible, the company desperately wanted their own port in the region. However, a naval superpower already had an iron grip in the region. For the 2 centuries prior, the Dutch had a monopoly on these lands and outpowered anyone who attempted to compete. As such, it was official company policy to not take any actions that might anger the Dutch, out of fear of disrupting the incredibly lucrative existing trade routes. But one tenacious company official named Sir Thomas Raffles took it upon himself to create such a port on the sparsely populated island that would go on to become Singapore. Situated at the tip of the Malayan Peninsula, it was the ultimate location to set up shop. After some back and forth in Europe, the Dutch eventually did nothing to stop the British from having the territory. But Singapore was not to become an ordinary port. In order to attract traders away from the existing ports in the region, Singapore was to become a free port, meaning there were zero taxes on businesses or port-related activities. This was a massive advantage over the other heavily taxed ports in the region, and word quickly spread. In just 4 years, Singapore had attracted tens of thousands of traders from China, Malaya, and India. Soon the horizon became full of ships as everyone clamored to seek their tax-free riches. But because of its lack of significant administrative oversight, Singapore became a hub for less desirable ventures. Slave trading, gambling, opium dens, violence, and prostitution became commonplace. But booming international trade continued to propel Singapore's importance and popularity. This was supercharged by the opening of the Suez Canal in Egypt. Trading from England to China was now 5,000 less miles, which in turn cut costs and dramatically increased shipping demands. The new route also now favored the Strait of Malacca instead of the Sunda Strait, meaning more traffic was passing by and utilizing the port. Singapore was now by far the most important port in the region, and as such, in 1967, it became an official crown colony of the British Empire. But yet another development would propel its importance further. The introduction of rubber trees in Malaya and booming global demand for tin, which was abundant in the region, meant Singapore was no longer just a stop on the way to China, but the hub for the riches of Southeast Asia. Resources would be extracted from the peninsula and then transported to Singapore, where it would be processed and shipped globally. As Singapore has no natural resources, this fostered a symbiotic economic relationship with Malaya. With its growing importance came greater British military presence, creating industry surrounding its dockyards and providing services to military personnel. By the year 1900, tiny Singapore would be home to more than 200,000 people, who were much better off than those in other nations in the region. But Singapore's centuries of unhindered growth would come to a screeching halt. As the 20th century progressed, Singapore, even being 6,000 miles away from Europe, was not safe from the ensuing global conflicts. During the Second World War, the Japanese Empire was engulfing all lands it came into contact with. In December 1941, the Japanese invasion of Malaya had commenced, and within 2 months, it was at Singapore's doorstep. Despite orders from London, Singapore was officially surrendered on February 15, 1942, and for 3 years, Singapore would undergo unbelievable suffering and destruction. Even as the tides of war changed and liberation came in 1945, the retaking of the island leveled much of the remaining structures. Singapore was no longer a jewel of Southeast Asia, but a smoldering pile of rubble. Devastated from war and neglected from a crippled British Empire, the rebuilding of Singapore was uncoordinated and unregulated. Haphazard slums started to dominate the island, infrastructure was not fully restored, and violence and opium continued to wreck the population. As one travel magazine put it, Singapore was filled with utter filth and poverty. One must see it with his own eyes to believe it. Over the centuries, the British did little to promote or integrate the diverse and densely packed population. There was no Singaporean identity, as each group lived amongst themselves, fought for their own resources, stayed isolated to their own customs, and oftentimes had conflicting interests with the other groups. Now, with terrible living conditions and growing unemployment, these groups started to engage in violence, further worsening Singapore's situation. For most of Singapore's existence, its desire to split from the British Empire was low, as its lack of resources meant it did not experience the exploitation that other colonies faced. When the British Empire was not able or willing to defend it during the war, with its now crippled economy, rising social violence, and with the decolonization of much of the rest of the world, the idea of independence started to propagate among the population. Singaporeans would go on to put their trust in one man to do just that. Lee Kuan Yew, a lawyer who spent his years studying in Britain, formed the People's Action Party, or PAP, and was able to successfully gain a few seats in local elections in 1955. Lee spearheaded the independence movement, prompting London to initially clamp down on the PAP. But with changing British public opinion in favor of decolonization, the process of independence had begun. In 1959, Lee was elected as Prime Minister on the promise of merging with Malaya, as in his mind, it was the only way for Singapore to survive. Its economy was symbiotically linked with Malaya. It had no capacity to defend itself, and it needed help in controlling the violence and righting its economy. Therefore, merging with Malaya made sense. On September 16, 1963, this became a reality when the former colonies of Malaya, North Borneo, Sarawak, and Singapore merged to become the Federation of Malaysia. But there was a problem. The Malaysian elections resulted in a party coming to power that ruled on the promise of putting ethnic Malays first. This was a problem for Singapore, which at the time was 60% Chinese and deeply mixed ethnically. Massive violence broke out in the streets, and the PAP, against their promise, ran in the federal elections on the promise of a fair and multi-ethnic state. The ruling party saw Singapore as a threat to political, social, and economic stability. As such, a unanimous vote ejected Singapore from the nation, just 2 years after the merger. Against its wishes, Singapore was independent and alone to fend for itself. Lee Kuan Yew found himself in an impossible situation. How do you build a nation out of a population that has no national identity, let alone make it a prosperous state? How do you create jobs when you have no natural resources? How do you pull 70% of your population out of abject poverty, house and educate them, and set them on a course for a greater life? Independence also brought the departure of the British military, further damaging the economy and taking away even more jobs. The cards were stacked against Singapore, which now found itself south of a Malaysia that planned to starve it economically by stealing trade, and north of an expansionist Indonesia who possibly had aspirations of invading. Lee Kuan Yew knew the fate of his fragile nation was up to him, and he decided he was going to drag Singapore into modernity, even if that meant with an iron fist. The first thing to overcome was the social unrest, while at the same time working to cement the PAP's political power. Individual freedoms were curtailed, free speech was banned, political opponents were jailed without trial, and draconian punishments were carried out for rioting, violence, and drug use. This hardline authoritarian approach even included public canings for chewing gum, graffiti, and public drunkenness. Anyone that spoke out against the government was sued into bankruptcy. Religious extremists, Communist Chinese, Malays who wanted to reunite with Malaysia were all silenced or worse. Lee Kuan Yew's solution to the potentially explosive underlying ethnic and social tensions was authoritarian rule. However, as horrible as this was, it worked in curtailing violence, in stabilizing the nation. In his mind, the population would not care about the diminishment of their freedoms if it meant he could provide them with economic prosperity and social peace. Free elections would continue in theory, however, they would be tampered with so much that the nation would become a one-party state under the PAP, whose rule still stands to this day. With the social and political situation stabilized, Lee would carry out a dramatic economic overhaul that would go on to enable a miracle. The most pressing economic problem to address was housing. Representing one of the largest slum populations on Earth, 70% of all Singaporeans lived in rough temporary structures with no plumbing. Lee instituted a controversial law allowing the government to buy land cheaply, to which row after row of affordable housing would be constructed. While initially inspired by the British welfare state, Lee did not want his people dependent on the state forever. As a way to give citizens a stake in the nation's prosperity, to increase upkeep of structures, and to build wealth, residents were heavily encouraged to buy their apartments at low rates. The way in which they could afford this was through another policy that forced a percentage of one's income to be saved, called the Central Provident Fund. Originally, the savings fund was for pensions. However, Lee modified it, allowing citizens to spend it on housing. Slowly, over time, the amount forced to be saved was increased to 25% of every paycheck, with another 25% being deposited by employers. This eventually made Singapore the nation with the highest ratio of savings to income earned. This savings policy, coupled with cheap rates for state-owned housing, proved to be a massive success. All citizens living in slums were housed, and most started to be able to own their own property. Today, 80% of all Singaporeans live in houses they own that were originally built by the state. This has allowed Singaporeans to largely avoid the extreme housing prices in other similar nations like Hong Kong. But building houses for the population would not nearly be enough if the economy did not have jobs for them to work at. With no resources, no real existing manufacturing, and neighbors reluctant to trade, Lee knew the only way to grow was by doing everything possible to attract foreign investment. Keeping in line with Singapore's historical roots, taxes and regulations were kept low. Companies were even given massive incentives like being completely exempt from taxes for 10 years. To keep wages competitive, Lee banned unions and actively encouraged businesses to fire all workers when faced with a strike. The government also started dumping money into infrastructure projects and creating sprawling modern industrial zones. Seeing as Singapore's domestic market was small, numerous policies were implemented to gear the economy toward exports. Mixed with Singapore's existing port, incredible geography, and business-friendly policies, simple, labor-intensive foreign businesses started pouring in. This was helped further by Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution in China that scared investors away from Hong Kong and Taiwan. Within just 10 years, Singapore had practically zero unemployment, and the economy was growing at a monstrous 13% every year. Singapore would continue to implement hyper-capitalistic policies to increase investment by foreign companies, so much so that it is the second easiest nation to do business in. With an economy starting to become ever more reliant on government intervention, Lee also took drastic measures to cut out corruption. This included sentencing those suspected to death, as well as offering some of the highest wages in the world for government officials, helping to reduce the desire to engage in corruption in the first place. This worked, and today Singapore is one of the least corrupt nations on Earth. This substantially increased the effectiveness of policy implementation, as well as increasing investor confidence, further boosting growth and cutting down on wasteful spending. But Lee did not want Singapore to always be focused on simple, cheap manufacturing. He knew the most valuable resource the nation had was its human capital. As such, he started creating technical schools, paid foreign companies to train workers, and created modern hospitals to keep the population healthy. This in turn brought in more specialized industry and thus higher wages, higher savings, and more budget for the government to reinvest in education. This created a positive feedback loop of productivity gains. By the 1980s, Singapore was now in the business of petrochemicals, pharmaceuticals, advanced computer components, shipbuilding, chemical manufacturing, and more. In fact, despite Singapore's lack of resources, it had become the world's third largest producer of refined petroleum. This is because it had once again become the regional hub of Southeast Asia, importing raw materials from its neighbors, processing and manufacturing them, and then shipping them across the planet. This status of regional hub was further facilitated by Singapore's rapidly growing financial sector, which strategically bridged the gap between American markets closing and European markets opening. This rise was also perfectly timed, as many Asian nations were undergoing tremendous growth, allowing Singapore to act as a logistical and financial hub through which foreign investment was distributed. This, mixed with pro-financial policies, allowed Singapore to become the fourth largest financial center in the world. But Singapore, coming from such humble beginnings, meant it did not have its own class of entrepreneurs. The lack of capital and technical know-how meant it was impossible for Singaporeans to build substantial companies of their own to compete on the world stage. Not wanting to be left out and to further facilitate growth, Lee organized a group of gifted civil servants and international businessmen to make efficient state-owned enterprises. This included Singapore Airlines, steel, iron, and chemical manufacturing, and many other capital-intensive enterprises. While state-owned companies are usually synonymous with inefficiency, in Singapore, their primary objective from the very beginning was to make a profit. Low corruption in government, Lee's willingness to shut down loss-making ventures, and the lack of unions, which kept costs low, meant these companies were wildly successful. By the 90s, the government began limited privatization of the most profitable, giving Singaporeans preferential rates for buying shares. These companies helped to diversify the economy as well as filling gaps in the market. The revenue generated was also placed in a sovereign wealth fund, which was then used to further funding for healthcare, infrastructure, and education. Today, Singapore is one of the richest, most advanced, and competitive economies in the world. It operates the second largest port, is the second easiest nation to do business in, and still attracts the third highest foreign direct investment. Its people have affordable housing, they have access to world-class healthcare, and their students test the highest in the world. Its government under Lee Kuan Yew was able to efficiently implement policies that relied not on ideology but on their utility to Singapore's long-term prosperity. But this has, of course, come at the cost of political and certain individual freedoms. While it's hard to agree with its authoritarian governance, it's hard to argue with its success. The consolidated power allowed Singapore to maximize its advantages while limiting its shortcomings. Singapore has always been lucky with its location on one of, if not the most important global shipping lane. It got lucky with riding the growth of globalization in the second half of the 20th century. But most importantly, it got lucky that its dictator, Lee Kuan Yew, was smart and more or less benevolent in his actions. While it might be easy for those of us that live in Western countries to criticize some of Singapore's actions, our ideals and institutions have had hundreds of years to form, while developing nations are expected to do the same in less than a generation. The path Singapore took should not be and likely can't be replicated by other nations. Singapore's economy is not perfect for the world, it's perfect for Singapore.